Bow. Hi everyone! Today's video is going to be a bit different. We're going to break down one of the pieces submitted by a subscriber. At the end of my previous video, I announced the launch of my Discord server, and to my surprise, more than 100 people joined within 2 weeks. That was incredibly pleasant, so thank you to everyone who came aboard. Inside the Discord, I opened up a channel where subscribers could send me their work for critique. Not a huge number of people submitted pieces, but a few did. And I really appreciate that. So today we're going to take a look at one of those works. This breakdown will focus on concept art. The piece we're looking at today is a redesign attempt of a character from Deadlock, Yamato. I'm honestly not sure how the name is pronounced properly. For context, this is what the character currently looks like in the game. Deadlock itself hasn't officially released yet, it's still in closed beta, and as far as I understand, Valve is gradually letting more people in, mostly through invites from existing testers. That part isn't especially important for us though. What matters is that the game is still in development and many of its character designs are clearly still placeholders. From what I understand, Valve has been updating those designs over time, and there are even rumors that this particular character may be reworked soon. Before making any judgments about the redesign in front of us though, we need to ask a very basic question. What exactly are we critiquing? In other words, what category does this image belong to? Is it a concept art, illustration, fan art, sequential art? The answer changes the criteria by which we evaluate it. Because every kind of visual work has its own purpose. And it only should be judged through the lens of that purpose. In this case, we're dealing with concept art. That means that beyond aesthetic considerations, utility becomes extremely important. What matters is not simply whether we subjectively like the image, but whether it successfully solves the task it was meant to solve. And this is something I'm going to keep repeating, not just in this video, but probably in many future ones as well, because it's one of those truths that needs to become second nature if you want to understand design properly. Design should never be judged outside the context of its use. If someone runs up to you, shows you an image and asks, so what do you think of the design? You simply cannot answer that objectively unless you know what the design is for, what product or project it belongs to, and what role it is supposed to play within the context. Here, we're looking at a concept art for a video game character. That means the drawing is part of a production pipeline. Most likely it exists so that the next person in the chain, probably a 3D character artist, can use it to build the character in 3 dimensions. And I know this sounds like very basic stuff. Everyone has heard it 1,000 times probably, and everyone thinks they already know it. But in practice, when people actually sit down to make this kind of work, they very often forget these fundamental truths without even noticing. Once you understand the purpose of a piece, the criteria for evaluating it follow naturally. To make that analysis easier, I think it helps to divide those criteria into 2 broad groups, technical and conceptual. You won't find those exact categories in textbooks or theory videos. I'm using them here simply as a practical framework to structure both my own thinking and yours. Honestly, the ability to structure problems, information, and tasks is one of the most important skills you can develop in this profession, I think. Without structure, it's very easy to go in circles for years, burning energy, repeating the same mistakes, feeling like you're working hard but not actually improving. So what do I mean by technical criteria and conceptual criteria? By technical criteria, I mean execution. How well the image communicates what it is trying to depict. This includes form, construction, volume, lighting, color, perspective, anatomy, material definition, and so on. It also includes whether the object, scene, or character makes visual or logical sense. Even if, depending on the style of the project, you may intentionally bend some of those rules. In a heavily stylized game, for example, many things can be justified as part of the project's visual language, which again is why context matters so much. By conceptual criteria, I mean what we would normally group under design itself: aesthetics, emotion, function, storytelling, and appropriateness within context. These are the more meta-level goals of the artwork, if you will. The reason I separate these two is simple. When you mix them together, everything turns into a mush. It really becomes much harder to evaluate your own work honestly, and just as hard to evaluate someone else's. When feedback starts to throw anatomy, lighting, form, construction, storytelling, and design decisions all into one pile, it stops being useful. It just becomes a swamp. And once someone gets stuck in that swamp, they can barely take a step because they no longer understand what the real problem is or where to begin fixing it. Personally, I would only move into a detailed discussion of conceptual issues once the technical foundation is reasonably under control. So let's go back to this concept and talk about first impressions. There are definitely things here that work. The character has a fairly strong overall silhouette. It's eye-catching, it grabs attention, and the design includes some memorable ideas and visually striking elements. But if we look at it through the lens of criteria we just established, technical and conceptual, it becomes clear that the piece has a lot of technical problems. And unfortunately, those technical problems then cascade into the conceptual and design side of the work. Beyond simple inexperience, maybe, this kind of issues can also happen when an artist becomes overly attached to a handful of ideas they really like and has a hard time letting go of them. What you get in the end is a design packed with too many competing ideas, each fighting for attention. We can trace this sometimes when we take a look at the process that the artist has undertaken to come to this result. In this case, the artist also sent over the thumbnails, which is great, huge respect for that. And the first positive thing you can say about those thumbnails is that they show courage and imagination. There are quite a lot of different options there, and they're genuinely varied, not just superficially different. The silhouettes vary, the character types, the props, the masses. That's very good. At the same time, there are some problems. For example, some of the poses and camera angles are not very optimal to showcase the design of the character. Let's take a look at the viewing angles, for example. If we look at the first two characters in the top row, some of the character's key defining elements are partially obscured. The sword, for instance, seems to be one of the central design features, but I can't even clearly tell how long it is because it disappears behind the body. The second arm is almost fully hidden as well, so we can't really tell what it's doing or what it's holding. For some other characters, the camera angle is too much top-down, which makes judging the character's proportion very difficult. So what happens is that the pose and angle are chosen in service of expressiveness and mood, but the choice undermines the concept's practical responsibilities, namely showing clearly what the character is wearing, how the design is built, what objects they're carrying, and how those objects function. And that is one of the core challenges of concept art. You have to walk a very thin line between making something inspiring and visually impressive on one hand, and making something purely functional and diagrammatic on the other. The goal is to maintain the right balance between those two extremes, so that the final piece is still artistic, it still conveys character, mood, aesthetic appeal, but also provides clear technical information, how the elements look, how they relate proportionally, what they're made of, how they function, and so on. Let's take a couple of thumbnails from the set and adapt them the way I usually do. The first thing you'll notice is that I work with a fairly large brush. The key point is not the size alone, it's that the brush is also quite hard and almost fully opaque, with strong pressure sensitivity from thin to thick. That allows me to sketch thin accents when needed without constantly resizing the brush, while still preventing me from drifting into unnecessary detail. At this stage, that's exactly what I need, a tool that discourages premature refinement. If while working at this zoom level I start feeling the urge to zoom in and solve some fiddly little detail, I strongly recommend stopping yourself immediately. That urge is usually a sign that you're trying to solve a problem that does not belong at this stage of the pipeline. The whole advantage of thumbnails is that they let you solve the first read of character in broad strokes, without getting bogged down in detail, without draining yourself, and while still keeping a fresh, clear head. That in turn lets you produce 5, 6, or 7 variations in a single sitting. At this point, I'm already fairly comfortable using tonal values when working on thumbnails like this, but that mostly comes with experience. Even now, if I'm distracted or tired, I can still lose focus and start introducing too many tones, which immediately creates problems. When that happens, I usually notice it and simplify the image again to restore readability. Earlier on, when I was actively training this method, I would literally set myself a strict limit, no more than 3 or 4 tones. It can feel restrictive. You may want to lighten a shirt, darken the pants, and start fine-tuning every surface. But that restriction is actually extremely useful. Whenever that urge comes up, remind yourself again, you're not at the stage where those decisions matter. With 4 tones, you already have more than enough tools to establish hierarchy and direct attention. You can decide where the eye should go, where it should rest, and where it should lose focus, simply by controlling the distribution of light and dark masses. If your lightest value only appears in 20% of the design, that alone can create a strong focal hierarchy. The same goes for strategically placed dark accents. That is more than enough to map out the character's overall structure. At this stage, color doesn't matter, fine design nuance doesn't matter, none of that is priority yet. What matters is solving the character broadly with a very limited set of tools, establishing the pose, the major masses, the number and distribution of important shapes, and making sure the silhouette is interesting. That is enough. You may also notice that when I work on these figures, I often try to simplify one side of the silhouette while making the other side more complex. This makes the design feel slightly less symmetrical and evenly distributed, but in a good way. I'm not talking about physical weight balance here. I mean balance in terms of complexity and detail. That kind of asymmetry often makes the character more engaging. Another thing worth noting is that when I'm not yet fully confident about the pose, I spend quite a while working in a single tone. At that point, it becomes more like drawing than painting with masses. I'm trying to find the flow of the figure, the overall rhythm, the action lines, the movement. It's similar to what you do in gesture drawing or figure drawing practice. You search for the first underlying flow before committing to anything else. Once I feel reasonably confident in what is emerging, I start bringing in additional tones. And if the pose is more familiar to me from the start, something I already understand well, I can introduce those tones much earlier and more confidently. And one final small tip. When you draw limbs, it can help a lot to place small marks or blobs where the hands or feet are going to end up. This is especially useful with legs. In other words, quickly mark the approximate plane and placement of the foot, then build the rest of the leg toward it. The brain generally finds it much easier to fill in the space between two known points than to improvise the whole path organically from scratch. That usually helps me a lot. Let's say you've already done a batch of thumbnails, your first pass at the problem. At this stage, the main priority is variety, not detail. I would consciously avoid going deep into rendering. The lack of polish is compensated by the number of options and the range of directions you can offer. Fine detail simply does not matter yet. Even if the client needs some small artifact, prop, or decorative element to be part of the design, you do not need to fully draw it at this point. A simple shape or mark is enough. Any reasonable client will understand that. What matters more is that you provide a varied base of options they can choose from, because that saves time and energy for both of you. Another thing worth pointing out is consistency of technique. If you look at the thumbnails submitted by the artist we're viewing, it feels like the rendering approach changes from one thumbnail to another. Some lean more into line art, some introduce lighting, some are built around graphic masses, and some already look like black and white sketches with much more nuance. That can actually become a problem because instead of comparing the designs themselves, the client may start reacting to differences in presentation. That is why the approach I described earlier, the brush choice, the limited zoom, the simplified handling of tone, is so useful. It helps keep the whole set visually consistent, so when you compare thumbnails side to side, you are really comparing poses, silhouette, character, and design rather than differences in rendering methods. Now let's say you have shown these thumbnails to the client, or simply spread them out for yourself, and you realize that 2 or 3 directions feel the strongest. The next step would be to take these selected thumbnails, enlarge them slightly, and continue developing them. At this stage, you're still working with the same thumbnail mindset, but now you begin to clarify things. The jump from stage 1 to stage 2 is actually pretty small. You're not rebuilding the image from scratch, you're refining what is already there. So if in the first stage the head, for example, was just a few value masses and a couple of marks for the eye sockets and mouth, now you can add a little more information. You can suggest the placement of facial features more clearly, define the jawline, indicate the neck, maybe add a simple shape for the ear. The idea is not to dive into detail, but to allow yourself one extra level of clarity. You can also zoom in a little more than before, but only a little. Not to start polishing, but just to give yourself slightly more resolution. That is the key difference. You're not unlocking full detail, you're only taking one step closer. The same goes for the tonal work. You're still not introducing a huge range of values. Instead, you try to squeeze as much information as possible out of the tones you already established. You keep using the same tonal pattern that already described the character, and you simply refine those existing shapes. only if you genuinely run into a readability problem. If some area of the character stops reading clearly at this scale, should you add an extra value. At this point, you can also begin slightly suggesting different materials, small patterns or accessories. But again, only in the simplest possible way. A highlight, a quick mark, a single brushstroke. You're not zooming in on a brooch, earring, or accessory to fully render its planes and engravings. That is not the task yet. It is still just a shape and it still has to work from a distance. So the goal here is still to avoid detail. You're simply increasing the density of the image by one step and refining what already exists. And the reason this stage matters is that by the time you move on to actual rendering and polish, around 80% of the important decisions should already be solved. Once you reach the polishing stage, you want to be focused mostly on form, color, material definition and execution, not still searching for design itself, not still wrestling with major structural problems. Of course, in practice, you will still change things later. That is normal. Sometimes an idea works at thumbnail size but starts falling apart when you push it further. And then you naturally want to rethink it. That happens all the time. But the important thing is not to knowingly carry unresolved issues forward. A thumbnail should not move to the next stage if it already feels wrong to you in the areas that matter. By the time you continue with it, it should satisfy you in terms of pose, proportions, placement of elements, and overall structure. I'm not talking about the fine detail or micro readability. I mean the major decisions, how the elements are arranged, how the design is distributed across the character, how the proportions work, whether the pose feels right. All of that should be resolved here. Because if you already dislike those things at the thumbnail stage but push the image forward anyway, you can easily end up in a bad situation. If you will show it to the client just for a beautiful number, for example. Imagine the client chooses exactly that thumbnail. That actually happens more than I want to admit. And now you're forced to finish a direction you never fully believed in to begin with. At that point, not only do you have to complete the piece, but also realize that half of it still needs to be redesigned. And that might definitely catch the client by surprise. There is very little value in working like that. The goal is for the thumbnail to answer most of the big questions in advance. Ideally, by the time you move on, it should have solved about 80% of the important problems for you. Then the next stage becomes much more focused. You can fully concentrate on technical execution, form, materials, color, and clarity, without your brain still being occupied by unresolved design decisions that should have been handled much earlier. That covers the thumbnail stage for now, so let's go back to the concept itself. Earlier we talked about how some of the problems we see in the final concept can actually originate much earlier, at the thumbnail stage. So the question is, did that happen here? I think in some way it did. One of the main issues in this design is that it tries to combine too many ideas at once, and several of them start to conflict each other. For example, the artist clearly wanted to expose part of the character's body, reveal the shoulder, and show a tattoo, most likely as a nod to the character's Yakuza background. At the same time, there is also this draped jacket or a coat element over the shoulders, which partially hides the very same area that was meant to be emphasized. On top of that, there is an attempt to introduce another visual cue often associated with Yakuza-inspired characters in media: the boss-like silhouette created by coats, trench coats, or sharply defined shoulders. That by itself is a valid idea, but now we already have two ideas pulling against each other. One wants to reveal the shoulders and tattoo, and the other wants to cover and frame that area with a strong outer garment. Then there is oversized zipper, which is another separate idea. Hyperbolizing a detail like that can absolutely work. It can become a strong design accent, but exaggeration only works when it feels appropriate and integrated into the rest of the design. And then, beyond that, the rest of the outfit suggests martial arts or sword fighting associations, while the true hero of the whole design is clearly the sword itself, which is huge and instantly steals attention. So the design is full of ideas. Some of them are individually interesting, but too many of them compete with each other. And because this is supposed to be a character for the 3D game, that matters a lot. All of these elements have to work not just in static drawing, but in 3 dimensions, in motion, under animation, under physics, and within the technical limitation of production. That means you have to think about implementation. What happens when all these loose elements starts moving at once? What happens when the character runs, the oversized zipper class swings around, the hanging fabric moves, the sleeve shifts, the back drape or coat moves as well? Now imagine multiple physically simulated elements overlapping and colliding with each other. That immediately increases production complexity. Once several large physics-driven parts began intersecting, you now have to solve collision hierarchy, clipping, rigging limitations, and all that ugly glitches that come with that. At that point, a design like this might simply be rejected, not because the ideas are bad in isolation, but because the concept is too technically overcomplicated to be worth building. And that is something concept artists need to keep in mind. If you look at Valve's own characters, which are often distinctive and stylish, they're usually simplified as much as possible. If they do have hanging or physically driven elements, those are often spaced apart so that they don't interfere too much with each other. Here the problem is not only that these elements would interfere technically, they also interfere visually. Different design ideas that might have worked well individually are now fighting each other for attention, and it becomes unclear what the real focus of the design is supposed to be. As for where this problem came from, I have a rough guess. I know from previous conversation with the artist that they initially selected one of the thumbnails we saw earlier and developed that direction further. But after receiving feedback both from me and from the community, they seem to have gone through another round of revision and started adding and changing things. What I don't know is whether the rethinking happened through a new thumbnail pass, or whether those ideas were added directly on top of the more developed concept. Based on what we have here, I would guess the latter, because this final concept barely resembles anything from the earlier thumbnail set. In other words, it looks like there have been no proper thumbnails for this final version, or at least none that we were shown. And that could explain a lot. Some of these ideas would probably have revealed their contradictions much earlier if they had been tested properly in thumbnail form. At that stage, because of the natural limitations of thumbnails, it would have been much easier to notice that too many conflicting concepts were being piled together. And there is another issue here too. Some of these solutions are not just visually conflicted, they're functionally implausible. If we look at the draped coat or cape from the back, we start running into problems of logic, not just drawing. First of all, if you isolate the garment and imagine it off the character, it stops making sense as an object. Like, what is it exactly? It doesn't really read clearly as a coat, a cape, or any believable piece of clothing. It feels like a strange decorative shell that only exists because it is draped over the specific pose. And that immediately weakens its credibility and starts to feel artificial. Beyond that, the sword itself would physically push that garment away from the body at this angle. Instead, in the drawing, it appears to pass straight through it. So the image is not just stylized, it becomes logically inconsistent. It depicts something that could not actually hold that shape. The same goes for the lower part of the garment. Why are these parts sticking out like that? What is holding them in place? It almost feels as if there should be an invisible internal frame supporting the whole construction. I know that the author intuitively did it just because it creates an interesting silhouette in a single drawing. But the problem is that it doesn't hold up as a believable design solution in a stylized realism context. And the drawing itself tells us this is not wind or some special force affecting the cloth, because other hanging elements, like straps, are clearly obeying gravity normally. That inconsistency is a problem, and a very popular one, I must say. It shows that the design is chasing several attractive ideas at once, without fully checking whether those ideas work together organically, whether they describe something believable, and whether they could survive transition into 3D while keeping their identity. To make that clearer, I decided to do something I probably will not make a habit of, but wanted to try once as a visual demonstration. I quickly blocked this setup out in 3D. I definitely would not recommend that as a default solution for every concept art problem, because it only makes sense if you're already comfortable enough in 3D in general, in Blender for example, to throw together a quick block out in a few minutes. If you are, it can be very useful. The more experience you get with 3D, the more your spatial thinking improves, and the easier it becomes to recognize when something you are drawing is starting to drift into fake, unnatural territory. In this case, I was able to rough the pose out quickly using a model I already had prepared. I know some people will say I could have used cloth simulation, but that would actually have been counterproductive here. The point was not to produce an accurate cloth sim, it was simply to recreate the silhouette that felt suspicious and show why it doesn't work. And the result is pretty clear. The sword would force a change in the shape of the garment. There is no way this exact configuration would hold up without the sword piercing through the cloth or displacing it dramatically. If you isolate the garment itself, it becomes even more obvious how strange the construction is. Those protruding parts seem to float in space, as if they need some hidden framework to exist. Yes, that gives you an interesting silhouette. No doubt about that, but silhouette alone is not enough if the concept stops feeling like a coherent, believable object. And that is the difference between building a cool image and building a usable concept. And there is another point worth mentioning. The game already has a character, if I remember correctly, Wraith, who uses a jacket draped over the shoulders with a similarly emphasized shoulder shape. So now this design is not only intentionally conflicted, it also starts bumping into the ideas that already exist elsewhere in the game's character roster. And then there is the zipper. Even setting aside the broader garment issue, the zipper itself raises a lot of logical questions. How is it attached? How is it supposed to function as it moves along that fold or fabric? What happens to the continuation of the zipper line? Once you try to think about it as an object rather than a graphic accent, then the drawing gives you very few answers. And I'm not bringing this up just to nitpick. This is very common beginner mistakes in concept art, adding design elements that look cool graphically but have not been thought through functionally or logically. That is why it's so important to keep remembering what kind of work you're doing. You're making concept art, not just a cool standalone illustration. A 3D artist will absolutely come back to you and ask, what exactly is this? How the hell does this work? And what the hell I'm supposed to do with this? And that is a completely normal production reality. I actually got some of those questions in earlier days. And all that also leads to another major point. This is not really a complete concept yet. For a character this complex, a proper concept would usually be a concept sheet. You would want front view, back view, and possibly profile. You would want callouts for the tattoo, for the sword in closed and open state, for the lower body hidden by the skirt, for how the legs are dressed underneath, and for what happens when the cloth moves and exposes areas that are currently concealed. Without that, unfortunately, it is not really functioning as a concept. And that is probably the main message not only of this section, but of the whole video. I do not want this critique to be just a teardown of a design that fails certain requirements. I want it to be useful, to give the artist something actionable they can grow from. So for me, the first major takeaway is this. Treat every stage of concept work as necessary and understand what each stage is supposed to give you. You do not make thumbnails just because that is what professional pipeline says you're supposed to do or because it makes you look serious. You do them because they're useful. They solve problems early. And I say that because I remember being younger and treating thumbnails exactly the wrong way. Back then, those stages felt boring, uninteresting, almost like annoying formalities standing between me and the fun part, the color, the polish, the visually exciting stuff. The reason I felt that way was simple. I didn't yet understand how to benefit from those stages. Once I learned how much they actually solve for me, I realized I was shooting myself in the foot every time I rushed past them. So that is the first takeaway. You need to really understand the purpose of each stage of the process and extract the full benefit from it before moving on. And the second takeaway is even simpler. Never lose sight of what you're making. You're making a concept, and a concept has a job to do. Now I want to try reworking this character myself, starting from the current design and showing how I would approach it. First, I should make one thing clear. I did not have nearly enough time to fully develop this concept, and I was not trying to do a complete redesign from scratch. What I wanted to do here was much simpler. I wanted to take the main ideas already present in the original concept, keep as many of them as possible, and see whether I could make them work together in a more organic way while avoiding the biggest problems we have already discussed. To do that, I started with thumbnails. To be honest, my first impulse was to jump straight into a colored concept and try to fix everything directly in the more polished version. But after 20 or 30 minutes, it became obvious that I was walking straight into the exact same traps. And that says a lot. Even when you have experience and visual mileage, once a concept reaches a certain level of complexity, it is still very hard to just brute force your way into a convincing solution without the right process. So I forced myself to step back. I went back to thumbnailing, then to a more refined path, and for the purpose of this feedback, I stopped there. I'm not doing a fully polished final concept with color and full rendering. What I'm making instead is a developed sketch, something that could serve as a solid starting point for a final concept. Even that much, I think, already shows how you can preserve some of the current ideas, improve readability and function, and avoid at least some of the same mistakes. That said, I still think that my version is a weak concept overall. I mean, the one I ended up with. To make it truly strong in terms of ideas and more appropriate specifically for Deadlock, I would honestly have had to start over from the very beginning. That would require a proper preparation phase, gathering references, exploring broader high-level ideas, and rebuilding the design with a clearer direction. But realistically, this video is already long enough, and with my current workload, I simply cannot turn a critique video into a full production redesign. While I'm sketching, I also want to say a few words about how I think criticism like this should be taken. I understand that my review of this piece may come across to some people as too harsh or too subjective. But I think anyone who has already worked in production and understands the kind of problems I'm pointing at will recognize that what I discussed in this video is not some unusual personal preference. It is a very typical concept art problem set. Once you seriously try to work in concept art professionally, you have to understand that issues like visual implausibility, poor readability, technical inconsistency, or illogical construction are not treated as small optional flaws. They're baseline problems. They're the kind of things that are simply assumed to be solved. If those fundamentals are still not in place, then in many cases you are not even really being considered yet. The actual job begins beyond that level. To exaggerate a little, it is like hiring someone as an editor or article writer and then wondering whether they know how to read or write. Of course, that is already assumed. If they do not, then the bigger professional conversation never even starts. Concept art can be similar. If there are major gaps in that foundational skill set, then most likely you just do not get the role. That doesn't mean there is absolutely no work available at earlier stages, of course. The market is complicated right now, and honestly, that is probably a separate topic, especially with AI and generative tools changing things so much. I should probably make a dedicated video about that later. Still, my guess is that there are areas, indie projects, more entry-level projects, highly stylized work, casual or hyper-casual spaces where visual impact and strong ideas can sometimes outweigh strict functionality and consistency. In those environments, you may be able to get away with much more abstraction, I guess. But I still would treat that as an exemption, not the rule. And yes, if my feedback sometimes sounds too blunt, I can only partially apologize for that. I grew up in the Russian art community, and that environment was extremely harsh and often outright toxic when it came to critique. So some of that directness is probably just habit. The Western side of the internet, at least historically, often leaned more towards support, cushioning, and softened criticism. I didn't really grow up in that environment. Still, the way I personally prefer to think about critique is this. If someone is seriously trying to grow in this field, they're already doing something brave. Most people never take the risk of trying in the first place. So the fact that someone is trying at all already deserves respect. And precisely because of that, when someone asks for critique, I prefer to assume they're not asking for their ego to be protected. They're not asking to be patted on the back. They're asking to be treated like a fellow professional, or at least a future fellow professional, and to be told the truth as clearly and thoroughly as possible. Yes, that can be overwhelming. Sometimes the amount of information alone can be discouraging, but if you can really accept that information, learn from it, and apply it, your growth can accelerate enormously. I have seen people improve at insane speed when they approach critique the right way. I have seen artists grow in a year or a year and a half to a level where AAA studios were actually chasing them. And I have seen others stagnate because protecting their ego mattered more to them than absorbing difficult feedback. And there is another valuable possibility too. Sometimes critique reveals that the work itself is not what you thought it was. You begin to understand what the profession actually requires, and that realization may be uncomfortable. But even that discomfort is useful, because it may help you realize that this particular path is not the best fit for you. And that is important. Maybe concept art is not the ideal direction for your personality, your way of thinking, or the kind of problems you actually enjoy solving. Maybe you would be much happier and much stronger in illustration, storyboarding, or sequential art. There are many adjacent directions where you can build a great career without needing to engage with exactly the same set of constraints. Sometimes adjusting your course a little can save you years of frustration and wasted effort. Anyway, I should probably stop preemptively coping with imaginary angry comments and mass unsubscribes. Instead, I just want to thank the artists who submitted this piece, did not get scared off, and allowed their work to be used as an example. I think a lot of younger artists will recognize parts of themselves in these problems, and in that sense, this kind of contribution is genuinely valuable for the whole community. And now a few words about the redesign itself. As you can see, I tried to simplify some things in the design, change the placement of the sword and some of the other design elements so that they would interfere with each other less. That still does not completely solve the issue of disappearing kimono sleeve, and to properly explain how that area works, I would still need extra views and callouts. That part cannot really be solved cleanly in a single image alone. Another thing I noticed even during the thumbnail stage was that the design would probably work better if the lower half were made lighter and less bulky, while keeping more of a visual mass in the upper body, or alternatively, probably even better, removing the draped coat altogether might actually be the stronger choice because it competes with the folded kimono sleeve, the exposed shoulder, and the tattoo. Focusing more clearly on those elements would probably create a stronger design. It would make the character feel more intentionally asymmetrical, give more clarity to the head and neck silhouette, and make it easier to emphasize her athletic build by fully exposing the shoulder. It would also create more room to use scars, something the original artist wanted to show on the face and chest. If more skin were exposed in a cleaner, more controlled way, that idea could come through more effectively without fighting against too many other elements. And because this is third-person game, I think the back view becomes especially important. So if some of the scars or other storytelling elements were shifted towards the back, that could actually make a lot of sense. Still, I only had time to do what I had time to do. You can also see that in order to make the redesign a little richer, I introduced an element that felt functionally justified. In one of the artist's earlier concepts, the characters seemed to be holding something like a shuriken or throwing knife, but I never saw where those weapons were actually stored on the character, and that is exactly the kind of thing concept art can use to its advantage. If a character throws blades or uses extra equipment, then the design can naturally include some interesting way of carrying those projectiles, these elements. You do not need to invent random storytelling props out of nowhere. The gameplay function already gives you a design opportunity. So I spent a bit of time thinking about how those knives could be placed in a way that did not break the character's main flow lines. I settled on a solution where they also help decorate the transition between the kimono and the skirt. Then, purely for character flavor, I gave her slippers, because in the original concept it was not even clear what she was wearing on her feet. The character also struck me as a stubborn, eccentric and slightly unhinged, based on the artist's description, so I wanted to introduce at least a couple of details that could support that side of her personality. Since I had no time to gather references and did all of those thumbnails and the redesign without them, I just went with the first ideas that felt playful and appropriate. So I gave her plush slippers shaped like dead hamsters, and a small plush chibi toy of a stereotypical Yakuza gangster hanging from the tip of the sword as a little accessory. Something silly that moves around and says a little more about her personality. So that is probably it for this feedback. It ended up a bit chaotic and definitely too long, but I still hope it was useful. This is my first attempt at this kind of video format, so obviously not everything is perfect yet, but I think with future videos like this, I will find ways to make the format clearer, tighter and more useful overall. Please keep sending in your work and join the Discord. Next time I think I will probably review an illustration instead, so we can talk about illustration-specific problems for a change. And I probably should not drag this already very long video out any further. Thanks everyone for watching, thanks again to the artist who submitted the piece. See you in the next video and subscribe.